Hello YouTube. One of the very best things about the Elder Scrolls universe is the variety in the races that you can play as, and by far one of the most interesting races are the Argonians, the race of humanoid reptilians that hail from the province of Blackmarsh. And over the many years of making lore videos, I have talked about the Argonians extensively, about their history, about their culture, and even about their methods of procreation in many different videos. And today I present to you all of that lore in this nice long form lore video for you to enjoy, with timestamps of course, so you can skip to a piece of lore that interests you or skip something that you don't care about, like this intro. Alright, with that being said, let's talk about the Argonians, starting with some basics and then moving on to some of their traditions. So, the basics. The Argonians, or the An-Xileel, are Tamriel's lizard folk. They are large human-sized lizards with a humanoid body. They originate primarily from the province of Blackmarsh, where most of the province is covered in deep swamps, with the bodies of the Argonians having been created in order to survive in those deep swamps. They are by far one of the most alien races of Tamriel, and as we will explore in this video, they are unique in almost every way compared to the other races, having a wholly unique culture, procreation method, myths, legends, and so much more. The in-universe lore reason for their uniqueness is that unlike the other races of Tamriel, which are said to either be descendants of the gods or having been created by the gods, depending on what creation myth you believe, the Argonians do not have a common ancestor with any of the other races, as the Argonians are the creation of yet another Tamrielic race, an older race, specifically this race of trees, the Histries. You see, at the dawn of the world, after time had started and the mortal plane was created, in a time where everything is unreliable as we don't know exactly what went down, we know that there was a group of beings called the Elnofey, or the First Ones, who are said to have been the ancestors of all mortal races on Tamriel, except for the Argonians. Now, we don't know much about this time, as many myths portray this time differently, but we do know that the Histries, mysterious, intelligent and sentient spore trees, were already present in this world as well. Now, many myths portray the Elnofey as having a devastating magical war at the time, which shattered the planet and gave rise to the continents as we know them, so Tamriel, Yokuda, Akavir, those continents. But the Histries, while not taking part in this Elnofey war, were very much the victims of this war according to the surviving legends, as they, being static trees, were defenseless and could only watch as many Histries died due to the incessant fighting of the Elnofey. It's said that in response to this, the Hist created mortal servants to protect them, mortal servants who would be able to survive in the swamps, the only part of the world where the Histries were still living after the Elnofey war. These mortal servants became the Argonians, mortal creatures presumably molded after the form of the Elnofey or inspired by the Elnofey, which is why they seem to have a humanoid body, but enhanced to survive the swamps. They have a long and storied history that we'll get into later in the video, but over the years they've developed their own tribal society in Blackmarsh, with several Argonian tribes living all over the marshes, although some have ventured out of the swamps and some have organized them to a greater degree, as we'll get into once again. These creatures, while having some traits of the other mortal races, were very different. Their reproductive cycle, for example, as we will get to later in this video, is completely different and linked to the Hist, as the Hist created them. Their traditions are alien to the people of Tamriel, and their language is incomprehensible for those not formed by the Hist, as we will also get into later. But one of my very favorite things about them that is different is their music, which is completely different to the music of the other peoples of Tamriel. So why not start out with that now that we're done with the basics, because it's really interesting. So let's talk about Argonian music. Now, the Argonians have a very peculiar musical tradition. For one, music and sound plays a big part in their communication with the Histries, the conscious and intelligent trees which created the Argonians in ancient times and still give direction and shape to their culture. In their communication and worship of these trees, the Argonians in some cases make use of wind chimes, the sound of which the Argonians then interpret, and in some cases they use that sound to determine what the Hist's will is. However, worship of and communication with the Hist is not the only way in which the Argonians employ music in their culture, as they have quite the unique musical repertoire. For one, they have some very interesting instruments which give Argonian music a unique sound. For starters, they are the primary users of a strange type of slide flute, They make use of their own types of conga Meyer drums, and they are known to make marimba instruments out of teeth of swamp creatures. They also use a lot of primitive bells, which they often hang on their tails to use while performing. And they have by far the coolest unique instrument of all cultures, which only they know how to play, the vossa satel, or frog pipes in the common tongue. It's a favorite instrument to many Argonians, and it uses a strange pipe system connected to 5 different swamp frogs, who then are connected to horns, while the player uses small buttons to regulate the sounds by decreasing and increasing the shape and sizes of the frog chambers, which is where the frogs are in. Now, the instrument makes horn sounds combined with rhythmic croaking of frogs, and according to many Argonians, it reminds them of home, and it's one of their favorite instruments. I mean, take a listen to how it sounds. Grand. Now, while we only have a few Argonian songs that we ever hear performed in the games, we know that they make use of throat singing often, and they often rhyme while singing. And the timing of their songs is a bit strange, as their songs often seem to have a very peculiar time change in them, with speed changes throughout the songs. And the songs that we can hear remind my friend, who knows a lot more about music than me and who helped me out with this video. He compared the songs of the Argonians to the modern day grunge style of music, as it often talks of negative emotions, however also of interconnectedness and connections. They sing of the negative sides of life, but also of unity within their culture. It's quite peculiar. Alright, now having talked about their music, let's now talk a little bit about how Argonians procreate. Now, the Argonians are quite an interesting race, in the sense that they are completely different biologically from all other of Tamriel's races. They were created by the Histries as their servants and protectors, and as such they are not descendants of the Almophae, or the original ones, which are said to be the far-off ancestor of every intelligent race on Tamriel. They are completely incompatible to procreate with any other race than themselves, with no offspring ever being recorded to naturally exist between an Argonian and another race on Tamriel. The only one we have is one couple in the Shivering Isles where it's told that Sheogorath himself, so a god, had to intervene to even make it possible, so no natural compatibility between the races and Argonians. But it is possible with some very heavy meddling of a god. That being said, Argonians were modeled after humanoids, and they have even been given sexual reproduction organs by the Hist, making it possible for them to have sex with any race on Tamriel. It just won't produce offspring. I'll give you one better even. While in general Argonians lay eggs as their method of reproduction, having eggs hatched by the Histries in their hatching pools, generally, the Hist have given Argonian females all the organs required for procreation as mammals, since the Hist can actually make it so that the Argonians can carry their own children and feed them themselves in periods of crisis where their hatching pools are not safe. This is why Argonian females have breasts, by the way. Now, even more interesting than this is that Argonian sex, so between two Argonians, generally doesn't lead to procreation and eggs being created, leading them to be quite casual about sexual pleasure in their relationships, as the only way to actually procreate seems to be mating in blessings of the Hist, which is actually done with elaborate rituals to find the strongest Argonians in combination who will get the best offspring when they mate together. This means that Argonians usually mate and get children with people of whom they are far from interested in romantically and usually don't even know. Again, there are exceptions to these kind of rules and traditions, as with all of the previously spoken about cultures, but it's pretty interesting. Now, one final interesting tidbit is that procreation is meant to be done under the watchful eye of the Hist. Then why is it so that Argonians have a sex drive at all outside of that ritual? Like, why were they designed by the Hist to actually want to do it for pleasure? I mean, just like the other races, we have examples of Argonian erotica in literature and art. So, yeah, pretty weird. And pretty interesting. Now, the answer to that may remain a mystery, but something that we do know a bit more about is their customs around love and the whole ritual that I described. So now let's look into their love and marriage traditions.
The Argonians have very different marriage traditions to the rest of Tamriel, and even different tribes of Argonians may have different customs. Many believe that the Hist are involved in some matters, deciding and making sure that mates meet and fall in love, even establishing the time of their future marriage for when the couple is prepared for it. In other words, the Hist manipulate even this aspect of the Argonians along with their biology. Now, regardless of Hist involvement, Argonian tradition dictates that an Argonian presents the person they wish to marry with a special ring with 3 flawless amethysts in it. The 2 on the sides represent the couple and the middle one represents the Hist. This tradition is likely to come from the Blythroats tribe or the Mire Dancer tribe, since they are renowned for their crafts. As for the marriage traditions themselves, well, it's debatable if Argonian weddings can even be considered weddings sometimes. The Argonians, especially the ones from Murkmire, have bonding rituals instead. You see, with some tribes, the tribe simply chooses who will lay the next clutch of eggs and produce the next generation of Argonians, and then pairings are made among this group of people, most from the same tribe, but bonding rituals are often made between different tribes to establish alliances, not unlike political marriages. Such pairings are made according to a variety of reasons: emotional connection, physical attractiveness, advantages to the tribe, among other selection criteria. Another important thing to note is that the pair has mutual respect and appreciation for each other in this ritual, but they don't necessarily have romantic feelings between them, as this ritual isn't really based on romance, because in the ceremony which is made, which we don't have any details on, as the details may even vary between tribes, is a ceremony in which a tree minder blesses the couple with good health and fertility, and then, well, they mate. The couple retreat to their nuptial huts, and then honeymoon time, baby. I mean, okay, jokes aside, this is one of the key elements of the Argonian bonding ritual. The couple has to mate and they have to generate new life. That's the crux of the whole deal, and that's why it's unlike a marriage in other places, because the couple doesn't have to remain together after the deal. Often they just go back to their life as singles after the bonding. The objective here is to increase the tribe's number and not to unite two people for life. A little bit of trivia here is that a letter in Skyrim found in the Temple of Mara from Talon J, one of the innkeepers of the PM Barb, asking the priest of Mara whether he can have a traditional Argonian marriage at the temple with Kivara, the other innkeeper. He even offers to bring books and writings and teach the priest the complicated Argonian language and the phrases needed for the ceremony. Well, if the priest of Mara accepts that, good luck trying to pronounce all the Gel stuff. You can try if you understand Gel, which is the language of the Argonians.
But that's about all that we know about their marriage and love customs. That being said, we also know quite a bit about what the average Argonian is looking for in terms of looks in a partner, because we know quite a bit about the beauty standards in Blackmarsh and among Argonians. So let's talk about that for a while, and trust me, they're peculiar, as one of the things that the Argonians seem to appreciate is a strong smell. While the other races have all kinds of perfumes to mask any smells, Argonians seem to find it attractive in some cases, which is interesting. Now, something else which the Argonians really appreciate are sharp and shiny horns on their head. We have some items which suggest that they both regularly sharpen and wax their horns, but in terms of wax, it's not just their horns, because they apparently also wax their scales, as clean and shiny scales are considered to be very attractive to many Argonians. And one funny little tidbit is that some of the chemicals that they use to clean their scales can actually burn the skin of other races or cause extreme rashes, so yeah, do with that knowledge what you want. Now, unlike most other races, smooth skin is actually not that attractive, as skin ridges and wrinkles are considered to be very nice to look at in Argonian society. Now, something else that's appreciated in Argonian society is having a broad tail, not necessarily for beauty, but in order to effectively participate in their favorite sport, Tibahatsai, a sport which no other race truly understands and which we'll talk about now.
Alright, so Tibahatsai, or Hip and Tail Ball, as translated from the Gel, the Argonian language. This game, which is very elaborate and has a set of ever-changing rules, is by far the most popular sport played in Argonian culture. According to the lore, almost every town in Blackmarsh has a playing field for the game, and nearly every Argonian has played it at some part in their life. The game, while very popular with Argonians, hasn't become very popular outside of Blackmarsh, as a strong tail is required in order to play the game. So none of the other races are really able to play it, since the tail needs to be able to smash a really heavy ball. So Khajiit tails are almost always too weak to play, as their tail contains relatively little strong muscles. Due to the strange rule set of the game, almost no non-Argonians are able to understand the game, and neither do many Argonians themselves actually. While the base game rule set is quite simple, there are many small rules that may change at whim depending on where or with whom you're playing. So essentially, talking about the base rule set, this is how it works. In ideal conditions, the game is played on a field of dry mud and salt meadow hay, but can be played on almost any type of field, even a wet field like the one we see in Murkmire. The field is a mud wall and a totem of sorts on each side. With every field, the exact height of the mud wall and the size of the field differs. Then on most serious fields there are 2 reed hoops suspended above the field, one about 30 hands above the field and one 50 hands above the field, although the exact height of these hoops again varies per field and varies per who you're playing with. And the fields in poorer regions like Murgmire don't even have the hoop suspended above the field at all. Each team has 5 players and the game begins when the servers throw a special type of heavy ball, and a really heavy ball, called a tiba, which is made out of the pasa gum. They throw them skyward, and from the moment that the tiba is thrown upwards, players are only allowed to touch the ball with their hips, elbows and their tails. At this point, the match becomes a battle for points. Players pass the ball from one to another in an effort to try and hit the opposing team's wall. Each time the mud wall on the other team's side is hit, then the team hitting the wall gets 1 point. If one of the teams reaches 10 points, the game is over and that team won. Simple enough, right? Well, yes, but there are more opportunities to score points during a game. For example, one can try to get the ball through the lower hoop suspended above the field. That hoop is very narrow and thus it's hard to hit, as the ball cannot be thrown through it during the serve, but it has to be smashed through the hoop with the hips, elbows or tails. Meanwhile, there's also the higher placed hoop. If one of the teams manages to get their ball through that hoop, the game is over and the team with the most points wins, regardless of what the stance of the points is. That could make for some interesting strategies. For example, if the opposing team is an excellent defender of their wall and you have a great tail aimer, someone who can aim very well with their tail smashes, you could try and have your team use the 3-point hoop and then the finisher loop to win the game with just 3 points, without even having to break through the defenses of the other party or them to reach you. But if you want to go for such a strategy, you'd have to have excellent aimers. Also, depending on where and with whom you're playing and with what specific rule set you're playing, up to 6 balls can be used at once in the game, also pinning into the strategy. With this game, many setups are possible, and almost every Argonian has played the game at some point during their lives, with some playing it fervently or even as a career. The tail is by far the most important body part for the game, as it's used for the actual shots, since shots with the elbows and hips aren't as powerful, and thus easily blocked. And it's said that the best players are short and bulky Argonians with broad muscled tails and a good aim. But weaker Argonians that want to play the game usually wear wooden armor pieces to protect them from the impact of the, again, very heavy ball. But usually these weaker Argonians are made fun of by other Argonians, as they think that the armor on them looks ridiculous. But again, each type of player is suited for a different playstyle, and there are many different playstyles of the game. Like the Argonian culture itself, the game is always in flux, and its rules changes depend on where, with whom, and what type of the game you are playing, and whether you are playing it and in what time period you're playing it. For example, in Murgmire they play a variant where dancing, singing and specific poses like standing on your hands add to the game points. And then they play with more than one totem on each side of the field and one in the middle. In addition to that, there are many more local rules with every local variant of the game. For example, in the game we can hear an Argonian watching the game setup complain how one game team is in favor because apparently the other team has a player who hasn't been licked by the frog yet and thus isn't capable for left field. But in other regions, for example, there are other really specific rules, such as rituals that come during the middle of the game or covering the ball in mud in specific stages of the play. Then there are some proposed variants where races without a tail can play as well, but only they are allowed to use their feet for kicking the ball rather than smashing it with their tail. But many Argonians likely reject that rule set, as they don't really like to play with non-Argonians, as they don't understand the rules of the game most of the time. That said, neither do many Argonians themselves. It seems that with simply going with the flow is what most of the Argonians do, just going with the local rules that local people make up. The specific rule additions don't seem to matter to the Argonians, as the fun seems to be in the fact that every game is different and ever-changing, just like their own culture is focused on change and the impermanent. That said, the standard rules of the game, the ones that I described, seems to be based on the Mesoamerican ball game. The ball game plays by most cultures in Mesoamerica, which is from like Mexico to Nicaragua. This game involved a very heavy ball that the players were supposed to pass to one another via the chest, hips and their elbows, and smash them through several rings on each side of the playing field for points. Apparently, due to the sheer weight of this ball, many of the ancient people would get wounded during the game, and almost every town and city had some form of a playing field, just like with Tiba Hatsai in the Argonian culture. And just like they have a very heavy ball that as some weaker Argonians wear armor.
So the similarities are quite obvious. But that's far from the last thing that we know about Argonian culture. For example, we know quite a bit about their cuisine. So what's their food like? Because we have several Elder Scrolls cookbooks which actually contain some lore on the subject.
The book even mentions that their cuisine is an impenetrable taste for outsiders. They eat a lot of raw fish and forest swamplands that they collect in the marshes. Their dishes are often accompanied by small side dishes in the form of everything that they can find, from small fish to insects and even other little creatures they find in the marshes. They basically eat everything. Most of their dishes are not made for the other races, however the book does mention the swamp shrimp boil. It's simple, a boil made out of shrimp caught in black marsh. This is one of the few Argonian dishes that has popularity all around Tamriel and has local varieties with local types of shrimps. So in Skyrim, shrimp caught in Skyrim.
Now, other than that, we also know quite a bit about their drinks, specifically their alcoholic drinks, which they serve in Blackmarsh.
The Argonians are quite an interesting bunch, because they have some quite ordinary drinks, but also some really weird ones. For example, they drink Thelui, which I did not pronounce correctly probably, which is actually a quite normal drink because it's sweet rum made from sugar canes. But they also drink fermented snake sweat, snail gin, which is gin likely made with swamp snails as the name implies, and phlegmwin, which is an alcoholic beverage made with swamp gases. If that sounds disgusting, it probably is. I couldn't convince Mr. Christmas to taste something like that. Now, next to these horrendous things, we know that Argonians also make ale and wines, and likely some alcohols based on hist sap as well, but we don't exactly know anything about that. Now, we also know that Talon J, which is the Argonian bartender in Riften, actually makes mixed cocktails of sorts. Some people have linked that to the Argonians specifically liking cocktails, since Talon says that he picked up his knowledge in a bar in Blackmarsh. But I think it's more likely that mixed drinks are popular all around Tamriel and that he just learned his skills at that specific bar and just brought that bar's specialities to Skyrim, where cocktails are less popular, as we do know that Nords like more simple alcohols. That said, the Argonians also have something which is called mud nectar, which is an alcoholic drink made from rice and seaweed and likely, well, some mud.
Alright, now having talked about a lot of their culture, let's now talk about some of the Argonians' beliefs. Let's talk about their creation myth. How did the Argonians think that the universe get created? And trust me when I say that this is quite a vague story, so please bear with me while I recount the story and then I'll do some analysis for you.
To start things off, a couple of disclaimers first. It's important to know that the creation myths of the different races and cultures of Tamriel are all often in many ways versions of the same events. The most common one, the one that we usually draw most parallels to, refers to the intermingling between Anu, the order, and Padome, the chaos. If that all sounds a little bit complicated already, I really recommend watching my introduction to the Elder Scrolls lore video, which is in the description, where I go over the basics of the most common creation myth. Now, second thing you need to know is that the Argonians aren't really culturally unified in various aspects. Different tribes may have different traditions and tales compared to each other, so their creation myths and religions can have some subtle differences between each other, especially between different tribes living far away from each other in the swamps. The creation myth that I'm talking about here in this video comes from the Adzi-Kostil tribe in the region of Murkmire, which is the only concrete Argonian creation myth that we know of, so it might be a more commonly accepted version of the myth in other tribes as well, but it might also not be. We don't really know as of right now, since this is the only one that we have that's documented. Alright. So, the Argonian creation myth states that in the very beginning there was only Atak, who is also called the Great Root, the origin of everything. Atak grew and grew, trying to fill all of the void in which it existed, with itself as it grew. Other roots then sprouted from Atak, roots that took names of their own and wanted to fill the space as well. Atak became aware of the existence of these smaller roots, which in many ways were just like him, yet also different in how they behaved. The new small roots enjoyed creating new strange things that only lasted as long as such things changed them. Meanwhile, Atak kept growing until something came from the void. It was similar to a root, but it had scales, eyes and a mouth. This new being called itself Kota, and it declared that it was hungry. Atak called this new being the Serpent, and they fought, biting at each other. The fight created many new things, and eventually they coiled and intermingled so much that they became one being. This one new being made out of these two primeval beings then shed its skin, and it cut off the smaller roots that we talked about before, and it called itself Atakota, who then said the word maybe. When Atakota said this word, the skin it had shed earlier gained knowledge of itself and thus became a new kind of being. And this new kind of being started to eat the roots that were cut off from Atakota earlier. And then, despite being dead, this shedded skin followed Atakota around like it was its shadow. This living shedded skin of Atakota we therefore call the Shadow. Atakota kept moving and roiling through the void during this period, devouring each of its fallen scales, which were worlds apparently. But now that Atakota was one, time was a thing, and now all things had a beginning and an end. The Shadow also wished that it could eat the scales, so the worlds, but its stomach was filled completely with the roots of Atakota that it had devoured earlier, which kept growing inside of the Shadow. When the Shadow could no longer bear it, it spat out the roots, which then it almost ate again due to its belly then being empty. But now it saw these roots as its own children of sorts, and instead of eating them, the Shadow told them the many secrets of creation before going to sleep, together with Atakota, who also went to sleep around this point. The roots, which were still awake then, found others and told them of how they had survived and had grown inside the Shadow's belly. Sharing this secret with the others then changed the roots, which then all took new forms and new names. Some of them wanted to keep these new forms and names, and they went on to create new things. They became spirits instead of roots. Spirits with the drive to create, but the Shadow, who stood for change, was part of their essence due to the secrets that had been shared, and all that they created was therefore temporary. Hunger and conflict then became known to these spirits, and they feared change, calling it death. The spirits were angry and afraid because of death, but the remaining roots showed them rivers in the void that Atakota had created in its path while rolling around. Rivers that could be used to hide from death. The spirits then grew content in the rivers, creating in the rivers as they wished, and in time they grew so much that they forgot their sleeping Atakota and its Shadow completely, and thought that they were the only ones left. There came a point, however, when there was no more space in the rivers, so the spirits went to the roots to ask for more rivers and more space to build and create in. The roots, however, were now also asleep, happy and content with their own creations, no longer having the drive to create more, as their creations were so subject to change that they didn't need to grow and occupy more space. The spirits then grew desperate, and out of fear for death and change, they attacked the sleeping Atakota itself, tearing its skin and draining its blood. Atakota was so damaged by this attack that it broke, reverting back to its primal essences of Atak and Kota. Atak remembered being everything at some point, and Kota remembered being nothing at some point, and so they began to fight once again. Learning of the concept of death from the spirits, the fight between them was much more violent than before, generating violence, blood and sap. The spirits then panicked, fighting and devouring each other in their dismay. Some of the surviving spirits drank the violence, blood and sap that was shed by Atak and Kota during their fight, and these spirits grew scales, fangs and wings, alluding to them becoming the dragons, and they would go on to devour everything that they came across. Some other spirits tried to protect what they had created, and a certain strong forest spirit, likely some Argonian aspect of Ifra, saw that the roots loved their creation like she loved their own, and so taught these creations of the roots to walk and talk. These creations told her secrets with new words, and the spirit sang to them. The roots then woke up and joined with the forest to protect their creations. We don't exactly know which creatures this refers to creating, but it's likely that these roots, which were changed by the forest spirit, is what became either the Elnofae, who you can learn more about in my aforementioned introduction video, or perhaps it refers to the creation of other living creatures. The myth is very vague on that, because it can also be said that the earlier fighting between the spirits is some sort of allegory for the Elnofae war, meaning that the Elnofae already existed at that point, so maybe it's other creatures that were created here, but more on that later. Now, the remaining roots then saw that Kota's blood created oceans and Atak's sap created stones. The roots realized that some of the creations that had originally come from the Shadow sharing its secrets with the roots had never even known the Shadow, as he'd been asleep for all this time, so the remaining roots attempted to wake up the Shadow, remember the living shedded skin of Atakota, and it asked it to protect their children. The Shadow woke and gazed at the situation. He saw Attack and Kota fighting, perceiving that the world was returning to how it was before everything. It then realized that it was born from Atakota, the fusion of both primeval spirits, and so itself, the shedded skin or the Shadow, was bigger than Atak and Kota on their own. So the Shadow devoured them both, snake and root, ocean and stone, blood and sap, and then devoured all the spirits. The Shadow then looked around for the roots that were its children, and when it found them, it realized that it was itself merely the skin of what came before, and that it now had devoured what had come after, and that this end would always be. The Shadow then shed its skin, even though that skin was all that it was, and this skin fell over the roots like a shroud, protecting them with secrets. Okay, that was quite a vague tale. There are many things to be discussed here. First of all, let's remember that the creation myths are in essence different versions of the same telling. Atak is supposed to be Anu and Kota is supposed to be Padome. Atakota is a very interesting entity though. It seems to be some sort of fusion between both Anu and Padome. And this concept is only present in only one other culture in Tamriel, the Yukuden pantheon, so the pantheon of the Red Guards, where there's a being called Satakal, which is also a fusion between Anu and Padome, or Satak and Akel in the Yukuden version. Now, there's another very interesting parallel here, because in the moment where Atakota says maybe, which I referred to earlier, that seems to be a reference to the creation of the universe, the Oribus, which some sources refer to as the Grey Maybe. The creation of this universe also gave birth to the Shadow in this story. Now, the Shadow ate the roots created by Atakota, and the Shadow is most likely a version of Sithis, who is held in great reverence by the Argonians. And it also fits the Shadow, who is not a destroyer only, but also a renovator and changer. Now, it's important to establish the difference between the roots created by Atakota and the spirits, which seem to have been the roots created only by Atak, who were devoured and later released by the Shadow. It seems plausible to describe the spirits as a version of the Aedra, who wanted to create but found their creation subject to time and death, and the other roots as the Daedra, which also created but their creations changed so much that they didn't need to grow. This also fits because the spirits, desperate for more space for their creations, attacked Atakota, tearing its skin and drinking its blood to obtain more power. This feels very similar to how the gods of creation noticed that their power was waning during the creation of the world in other creation myths, and then tore out the god Lorkhan's heart from his chest. Again, watch my introduction to the Elder Scrolls lore video for that whole thing, but in their attack, the spirits separated primeval beings again, which then began to fight once again. And in their despair, the spirits began fighting and devouring each other as well. Like I said, this feels like a bit of a reference to the Elmo-Fae Wars at the beginning of the world from other creation myths, although that is a bit vague, because there's also some references to what could be the creation of the Elmo-Fae in other parts of the story. Although, that could also refer to the creation of other living creatures on Tamriel. Of particular note here is the passage saying that some of the spirits drank the violence, blood and sap from Atak and Kota and grew wings, fangs and scales, which is of course a reference to the dragons. It's really intriguing to see the dragons being referenced in the creation myths of other cultures, because as far as I'm aware, we haven't really seen that so far in many creation myths. Now, there's also a reference to some kind of forest spirit, which would be Ifrit, a very important deity to the Bosmer and some other cultures. Kind of random one to fit in, to be honest, but Ifrit is also portrayed as a female spirit for some reason in this story, so perhaps it's a completely different being, but a lot of people in the community seem to think that it refers to Ifrit. The story ends with the roots asking the Shadow for help, and the Shadow then eats Atak and Kota, some spirits, and it eats the world. But it then sheds its skin to become a new, protected world for the roots. This draws once more a parallel with the Yukuden creation myth, where Satakal is being called the World Skin by the Yukudens and Redguards. But it gets even more interesting when you remember that Atak and Kota are supposed to be Anu and Padome, the spirits meant to be the Aedra, and the world meant to be, well, the world. So it seems that the Argonians apparently also believe in some sort of Kelpic cycle, with a new world coming after the other, with one version of the world being devoured by, in this case, the Shadow, and then there will be a next world protected by that skin. Which is also something several other different cultures tend to believe, although in different formats. It particularly fits the Argonians though, since there are people that see death and change in a very different light compared to other peoples. So it's worth mentioning. Now,
one might be wondering where the Hist are in all this, and the Argonians themselves. It's a fair question, but this tale strangely makes no direct mention of the Hist or how the Argonians themselves came to be, but we may take some educated guesses regarding this, because we do know that the Hist are a very ancient race of sentient trees, but it's unclear if they originated from Tamriel along with the Elnofey, or if they, as some sources claim, came from Oblivion instead. What is known is that during the Elnofey Wars during the Dawn era, which takes place after this whole creation story, that Elnofey War destroyed much of the Hist's domain in Nirn, which is one of the reasons for them to be somewhat confined within Blackmarsh nowadays, according to legend. But that does mean that the Hist also came to being somewhere directly after this story. Following this, the Hist supposedly created the Argonians by evolving ancient marsh lizards and granting them souls, changing them to be their agents and protectors in the world, their children who could protect them from others. Now, comparing this to the tale that we've discussed here, it seems plausible to consider that the Hist either are the roots or having been created by the roots, which took the shadow as its protector at the end of the story. This seems to fit a bit with the Hist, as they see Sithis as their own creator, and it also falls in line with the reverence that the Argonians themselves hold towards Sithis, so that's quite interesting, but to be honest it's a bit of speculation, as it's very unclear who these roots at the very end of the story refers to, but considering the Hist created the Argonians and the Argonians worship these trees, it's very likely that these creatures, which basically inherit the world at the end of this story, are supposed to be the Hist. But that's some speculation. Now, what I personally really like about this creation myth is that it's a return of sorts to some of the really weird parts of the Elder Scrolls lore, which is drenched in allegories and vagueness, which isn't my expertise, although I do enjoy learning about it from time to time. But now, having talked about their creation myth, let's now talk about something of their history, specifically a pattern in their history of advancement and then regression. Because in some parts of history the Argonians were actually quite advanced, and in other parts they are really primitive. So let's talk about that now.
Alright, for starters, in the earliest times before even the elves of Altmerish came to Tamriel, the Argonians and the Khajiit were already present on Tamriel, together with some other minor races, including a human race called the Kothringi. Of those races, the Argonians had by far the most advanced society. Their society consisted of a sophisticated civilization with large stone cities, with advanced metallurgy, sciences, and construction technology. They had large temples in the forms of immense stone pyramids that they called the Zen-Meres. Many of the Zen-Meres were dedicated to Sithis the Destroyer, a version of Sithis which the Argonians did not directly seem to worship, but whose existence and influence on their lives they acknowledged. The Argonians and the Hist of this time period believed that Sithis was a destroyer and would eventually bring destruction upon everything that lived. The Argonians and the Hist feared this destruction by Sithis, so much actually so that during this period they rapidly advanced themselves as a society in order to arm themselves against the destruction that would be brought by Sithis. They created a building method which had them erect buildings that could withstand all forms of destruction, and most importantly the Tent of Time. The apex of this destruction resistance were the Zen-Mere pyramids, gigantic pyramids built within the swamps of Blackmarsh. These pyramids were built to withstand the test of time and withstand the destruction of Sithis at the end. The society they built had actual kings, kingdoms, functioning governments, and actually a very large priesthood. Many of them were dedicated to the Hist and to the communication with the Hist. But some priests during this time period were also dedicated to Sithis, not to directly worship him, but to appease him, in hopes that the Argonian society would be evading his destructive wrath if they appeased him. They did this appeasement of Sithis mostly in the form of blood sacrifices atop the Zen-Mere pyramids. Kind of, similar to the Aztecs in our real world. During this period, the Argonians were far more organized, and instead of their current fleeting way of life, going with the change, they tried to change the world around them and resist the change that came to them from the world. And they did this by building things to last, by building things that time would not change, and by trying to take control of the land themselves, by attempting, for example, to take control of the weather. They also attempted to have their society itself withstand the test of time by creating an expansive calendar, not only bringing order to time, but also bringing order to their society, as their calendar, the Sinchai-Konu, tells them what to do in which months. However, this society, which outsiders called the Zen-Mere society, after the large pyramids that this society built, and the Argonians themselves called the Days of the Stone Nests, referring to their stone cities, That society came to an end somewhere in the early to middle Meretic era. Why exactly their society changed is unclear. What we do know, however, is that they did not get destroyed, but rather they changed themselves willingly to a tribal state, back from their very advanced state. They abandoned their ancient cities and their time with standing pyramids, and just went to live in tents and wooden huts in the swamps. This event of the Argonians reverting back from, well, what at the time was probably the most advanced society on Tamriel to basically a tribal people without any technological advancement, that event is called the Duskfall. As said before, we don't know exactly what triggered the Duskfall, why it happened. All we know is that the Hist led the way, as a quote in the game states, in starting the event. The Duskfall is shrouded in mystery in that sense, but we do know that during the last period of the ancient Zemir society, the History suddenly refused to speak to the Argonians anymore. The priests in the tree wards no longer heard the Hist. That is, until after some time of the full shutdown of communication, an Argonian named Jaralid found a new way to communicate with the Hist. To be precise, he found a way to indirectly communicate with the Hist by, for example, having the Hist manipulate wind chimes and speaking to the Argonians through those chimes. Through this new communication method, the Argonians discovered from their tree creators that, contrary to previous belief, Sithis was not only the father of destruction, and that he was not only to be feared. The Hist told them that he was also the Lord of Change, and that change might not always be as bad as they previously assumed it was. That it would be better to just believe in the good of change and the good of impermanence, to not be afraid if things change or get destroyed, but rather go with the flow of this change, to essentially just embrace the impermanence. And as the Hist told them to do so, the Argonian followed. They abandoned their large stone permanent cities and calendars in favor of lifestyles of impermanence, one of change. The Argonians we see now no longer fear change and see the building with stone, which other races still do, or trying to build anything permanent for that matter, as something silly and as an attempt to resist the inevitable change of Sithis. At least they believed this until the Third Era. We don't know exactly what the situation of the Argonians is by the time of Skyrim, so by the Fourth Era, but we do get a glimpse of it during the Elder Scrolls novels Infernal City and Lord of Souls, and we learn that in the Fourth Era the rulers of the Argonians, the An-Xileel, are once more living in the ancient Zanmir pyramids and using them, meaning that somewhere in between the Third and Fourth Era the Argonians may have once again changed their beliefs, and the Hist now also communicates a bit more directly with them, as we learn from the novels. Although we don't know much about the Fourth Era Black Mars, it was just something interesting to note, since apparently during this period at least some of the Duskfall was, sort of turned back upon. Meanwhile, previously the Argonians had no real incentive to go back, so somewhere between the Third and the Fourth Era there might have been some sort of incentive to at least partly go back to that time.
Now, so far you've been listening to me from 5 years ago, but now, in the year 2025, I think a workable theory for this whole reversal of the Duskfall could actually be that the Oblivion Crisis, in which the Argonians en masse returned to the marshes to fight Mehrunes Dagon's forces and actually overwhelmed them and went into the Oblivion Gates and then forced Mehrunes Dagon to close it, maybe that event led to the Hist realizing that, hey, perhaps we do need some more substantial defenses than, tents and huts, but that's just speculation. Okay, back to the original research.
Also, something that really interests me is that at the start of the Duskfall, I might have completely overlooked something, but as far as I can tell, we don't know anything about how the Hist suddenly changed their view on Sithis, and why they changed their method of communications with the Argonians at all, and whether or not this change was even voluntary. I mean, it might have been imposed upon the Hist by something or someone limiting their communications from the outside. Although the chances of this are relatively slim, but the reason that this thought came to me is because before the Duskfall happened, some histories actually saw a change of sorts coming and attempted to resist it by, for example, bargaining for safety with Daedric princes, meaning that the change might not have been completely voluntary. But we don't know enough about it to really make a speculation on it.
Now, after this quick overview of patterns in Argonian history, you may be left wondering, what's that An-Xileel that I mentioned earlier, that Argonian government? Well, you're in luck, because that's what we'll talk about next, the An-Xileel, the Argonian government in the Fourth Era.
So, the An-Xileel are the current ruling faction of the independent state of Argonia, or Black Marsh. They're a big mystery to most of us, and it seems that nobody really knows exactly what they're about. So, back when I originally made this video, I dove into the Elder Scrolls novels, in-game books and dialogue and pieced together everything that we have on the An-Xileel from all the little bits and pieces that we have. So let's start at the beginning, back during the Oblivion Crisis, when the An-Xileel first rose to prominence. The An-Xileel are a faction of nationalistic Argonians which played a big role in the Oblivion Crisis in Blackmarsh. They, in combination with the Hist and the other Argonians, drove back the hordes of Oblivion with such a fury that the Oblivion gates had to be closed, because at that point it was basically the Argonians invading Oblivion rather than the Oblivion horde invading Argonia, or Blackmarsh. After the Oblivion Crisis, the An-Xileel, just like the Thalmor, claimed that they were the ones responsible for ending the entire crisis on Tamriel and used that to gain popularity in Blackmarsh, ultimately ending up in control of the organized governments in the province. Like I said, in their rise to power they are quite similar, and there are quite some parallels with the Thalmor in Somerset Isles, because just like the Thalmor in Somerset, the An-Xileel used the lie that they were the reason for the end of the crisis to gain popularity with the support of the people. They drove away the few Imperial legions and governors from Blackmarsh that were left after the Oblivion Crisis, and after that they were basically in control and started to oppress and drive out all their political opponents as well domestically. After taking over, the An-Xileel looted and burned down Imperial buildings and put the former Imperial government workers to public shame while continuing to paint themselves as the saviors of Blackmarsh. Upon seizing power in the province, they really began organizing themselves into a Blackmarsh-wide government. Before the Oblivion Crisis they were simply some sort of paramilitary faction, but several years after the Oblivion Crisis the An-Xileel had transformed themselves into an actual government. We don't know much of the government structure itself, except for a few bits. One of the few things that we do know is that their government frequently communicates with the Hist, but it's not necessarily controlled by the Hist, unlike previous Blackmarsh governments, as they sometimes even disagree with the Hist. For example, during the Umbriel Crisis, which features in the Elder Scrolls novels, they only communicated with one rogue history which agreed with them in Lilmoth, and ultimately they ended up cutting themselves off from all the other histories, meaning that by the 4th era, the Hist are no longer truly in control over most Argonians, as under the An-Xileel, they're partly cutting themselves off when they don't agree with the Hist. Their government is partly based inside a large buried Zanmir pyramid that was built by the Argonians during ancient times. That pyramid was subsequently excavated by the An-Xileel after they drove out the Imperials. The interesting thing here is that these pyramids were abandoned in ancient times during what was known as the Duskfall, a change in Argonian society which was started by the Hist, and in which they became more primitive as they left behind permanent structures like those big Zanmir pyramids. Meaning that the An-Xileel partly or even fully turned away from the Duskfall and the wishes of the Hist in that regard as well. Anyway, back to the An-Xileel government. We know that one arm of their government, while one without too much power, is called the Organism. It's a part of their government made of human, Khajiiti and Elven advisors who communicate with the government, advising them on matters like the Altmeri Dominion, the Empire, human relations, etc. We also know that they have several layers of government which do have significant power. Example of these are city councils, which the previous Argonian government didn't really seem to have as they weren't too very organized, with one council basically governing each city in Blackmarsh. This suggests that the An-Xileel are actually quite well organized, as opposed to just being some Argonian tribe which suddenly took over Blackmarsh, which is a bit of a stigma that some of the lore communities still cling to, which I don't really understand, but alright. Something else, that they are very totalitarian, as they repress political enemies and dissidents, while their biggest goal is actually to reverse everything in Blackmarsh to how it was before colonial powers like the Empire and the Thalmor took over foreign lands like Blackmarsh. Basically, their goal is to have Argonia truly be the Argonia of the Argonians again, which is part of the reason why they themselves apparently call it Argonia, as Blackmarsh is just a colonial name given to the province. This means that they basically seek to remove all Imperial influence from the land and make Blackmarsh basically great again, or make Blackmarsh for the Argonians again, and thus make it Argonia again. In terms of foreign relations, their relationship with the Empire and the Altmeri Dominion is, well, okay, I suppose. The An-Xileel are nationalists first and foremost and have no ambition of conquering more of Tamriel, except maybe some of the areas which they thought may perhaps belong to the marsh, like the Blackwood area of Cyrodiil or the most southern regions of Morrowind, which they actually did conquer in the Accession War, of which there will soon also be a remastered video out, since that one is also quite unwatchable by modern channel standards. But all the An-Xileel truly want is to rule Blackmarsh, or Argonia as they call it, and have it be Argonia rather than whatever the colonial powers want it to be. They use a lot of anti-Imperial and even anti-Thalmor propaganda on their people to avoid entering pacts with them, forging alliances with them, or falling under their rule. They also have a special name for Argonians living abroad or under governments beside the An-Xileel, or who were previously loyalists to another government like the Imperial Government before the Oblivion Crisis, and they call those people the Assimilated, thereby outcasting those with substantial knowledge of the outside world and further consolidating knowledge of the outside world firmly into the hands of the An-Xileel. Enemies of the government or former Imperial loyalists get exiled to the bad parts of the towns, thereby making it more appealing for Argonians to support the An-Xileel to secure better lives for themselves in their new society. This all means that Blackmarsh has become largely a neutral and very self-focused state, a bit of a wild card in Tamriel's politics, so to say, not really liking anyone in the world but with no real intentions of attacking anyone either, and just focusing themselves on their own population. This can actually be confirmed by the map that we can find in Skyrim, the trade route map of the East Empire Company. On it we can see that at the time of Skyrim, Blackmarsh basically trades equally with both the Empire and the Dominion. We also know that at some points Imperial and Thalmor delegations entered Blackmarsh to speak with the An-Xileel to foster diplomatic relations, but that the An-Xileel apparently wouldn't take sides with either of them, and to date they haven't supported either side, so not the Empire or the Altmerry Dominion. While they do trade and communicate with the Dominion and the Empire, they maintain very strict policies on who can enter Blackmarsh and its cities. There are no foreigners allowed into their cities besides those specially approved by the An-Xileel. This has actually resulted in the spawning of large trading towns in front of the actual cities in the harbors, creating special towns where foreigners can live next to the actual cities, where the conditions of course are much worse than in the cities. And the final thing that we do know about the An-Xileel is that they are the ones who initiated the Argonian attack on Morrowind, so the Accession War. Actually, the only canon image that we have of a member, or rather soldier, of the An-Xileel is this card from the Elder Scrolls Legends, which shows one of their soldiers, probably during the Accession War.
Alright, but enough about the 4th era politics of the Argonians, because that's literally all that we know. Next, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about how the Argonians view death and how funerals work for Argonians.
The Argonians believe that their souls come from the Hist, given to them by drinking the Hist sap when they are born, and then returning to the Hist when they die. The Hist provides them with blood, breath and essence, which are the most important to them. So the Argonians don't really treat their death, that is, as corpses, with much reverence or anything. Their funerary rites are really simple compared to most of the other races. When an Argonian dies, their body is laid to rest in the marsh, returning to the land and therefore to the Hist. Even Argonians who die away from the Hist, away from Blackmarsh even, can still rejoin the Hist by simply having their bones returned to the marshes of the province, which actually gives a whole new dimension to the line that Hadvar says at the start of Skyrim if the player chooses to be an Argonian, because he then says, "I'm sorry, we'll make sure your remains are returned to Blackmarsh," which is actually in line with Argonian tradition. When the Argonians return their deceased to the Hist, they usually simply bury them or simply lay them on the ground with no cover at all. The deceased, though, does receive a funerary mask made of wood and a survat, which is a grave stake which impales and pins the body to the ground. This serves 3 purposes. 1, it prevents the corpse from floating around when the marsh inevitably floods, since that's what happens in marshes. 2, it prevents the corpse from returning as a bog blight, which is a sort of a zombie. And also, the Sulvat is carved with the story of life of that Argonian. Their tales or feats in war, their childhood stories, names of friends, personality, dreams, anything. The Sulvat tells the story of the deceased Argonian to whomever wishes to read upon it. Until one day, the Sulvat, along with all of the body, is claimed by the swamp. Although, basically this whole funerary rite can be done anywhere in the swamp, it's not always as random, because the Argonians can also bury their dead just among the roots of a history in organized graveyards in places that held sentimental value to the deceased, or, like I said, simply where they fell down. Argonians also have special priests to deal with death whenever it comes to a tribe. They are called the Grave Singers. When death comes, they sing the departed one's final song while carving their sulvat, so the
stake that is going, impaled in their body. They also serve as historians of sorts, reading the stakes of their tribe, which is very curious on a culture that sees everything as impermanent and temporary, not really giving much importance to the past and the future, at least not in the way we see the Argonians. Like the Altmer, Argonians also have punishments for those who dishonor or commit blasphemy against the Hist and the Saxhleel people. They do this by denying the deceased the ability to return to the Hist, by sealing their remains in a special urn. And in terms of necromancy, well, Argonians don't really care about necromancy. I mean, they'd rather not see it happen, but usually in the marshes their corpses decay so swiftly that necromancers usually don't even bother trying to go into Black Mars to raise corpses. Alright, having talked about their beliefs about death, let's now talk about something else. Let's now talk about their language, which I mentioned multiple times before in this video. The language Gel. So, in case you hadn't figured it out yet, all races of Tamriel in lore have their own language, even though they speak English in the games. Lore is always a bit different from the games. Even human language is said to be very different from, for example, the Elven language, but if you followed my lore lecture series on the early Elder Scrolls history, you will know by now that all languages on Tamriel have a similar origin, their origin being the Old Elnofex language, the language of the Elnofey, as the Elnofey are the precursors of all intelligent races on Tamriel, and thus all languages in Tamriel are essentially branches of the Old Elnofey language. They essentially all use a similar structure and a similar writing pattern to that old language. If you want to know more about that, I recommend watching my lore lecture series, specifically the one on the first half of the Meretic era, as I go more deeply into the writing and language aspect of things there. But the point I'm trying to make here is, all languages on Tamriel have a similar origin, except for the language of the Argonians, the language Gel. Gel as a language is very, very different from any other language on Tamriel, and it might actually be the oldest language of them all. For as far as we know, it never truly evolved or devolved into sub-languages throughout history, since that would change the language to a dramatic degree. We'll get to that later. Another big reason why it never devolved or evolved is most likely because all Argonians inside Black Mars are more or less connected with each other by having all their connections to their creators, the Histories, and then through the Histories being connected to each other. It's believed that the Histories learned the Argonian language to them, and staying in contact with the trees might have been the reason that it hasn't really evolved, as in our own world, language evolves when groups of speakers have been separated for a long time, but in this case the entire group remains somewhat connected to each other through their creators, meaning that any evolving or devolving from that reason would be very slow. And in a way, it wouldn't really make sense for this language to evolve, as we hear in lore that Gel is as close of a speech to actual thought as can be. According to Argonians, their language is able to convey thoughts into speech in a way that no other language is capable of doing. To be able to do so, one must be fully fluent in the language and have a very, very, very precise pronunciation. And in addition to that, must also have very precise body language, as body language like whipping your tail as an Argonian or squinting your eyes is a very important part of the language to convey your message fully. To be able to use this language to its fullest extent, the Argonians learn it directly from the Hist in their youth, among other things, by hatching their eggs close to the trees and drinking their sap in their youth. We have some examples of Argonians growing up outside of Black Mars with limited connection to the Hist, and this actually completely damages their ability to learn the language, because they have a very bad time to learn the language. They will never quite get on the level of their Black Mars native brethren, meaning that to function in Argonian society, it's best for an Argonian to spend his youth in Black Mars, as otherwise your connection to your race, because the connection to your language, will be very severely severed, as they will never truly be able to nail the very precise body language and very precise pronunciation. It is also hard for other races to learn the Argonian language, as it's innately different to any other language on Tamriel. As said before, most Tamrielic languages follow a similar structure, as they all come from Old Elnofex, the language of the Old Elnofey, and thus, for example, grammar rules will usually be familiar to an extent to, for example, a human trying to learn the High Elven language. Its structure and concepts will be largely similar. But Gel is very different. It relies on very precise pronunciation. If you have an accent, it could change a part of your message. The fact that an accent or any different pronunciations can completely change your message may also be one of the reasons why the language never really evolves, or very slowly evolves.
And also one of the biggest barriers to foreigners learning the language, or Argonians learning one of the other languages of Tamriel, is the fact that the way that the language handles time are very different. Tamrielic languages are largely structured in a way like ours. They are time dependent, with past and future tenses. So for example, I can say, I will finish this video in a short while, or after a short while I will have finished this video, or before making this video I was playing Luigi's Mansion. All those statements have a concept of time in them. Gel doesn't have those concepts of time. There is no concept of time and no way for me to explain this very clearly how it would work, as this is one of the limitations of the English language. You cannot say something without a point of time being used as a reference or being involved, be it past, present or future. But in the Argonian language, all those, past, present and future, are all at the same time true, and neither of them are true at the same time. There isn't even a word for time in Gel. Everything is just one state of being, and they take a holistic approach to events. Argonians find it very strange why we would want to establish a linear sequence of events. They find it strange we think in a linear way in a linear sequence of events, and they think that it would be way more convenient like they do it, as a holistic apprehension, meaning that they take all events as equal, not having the concept of time. If you think this is weird, it is, both to you and me. English and my own native language, Dutch, are all time-dependent languages. However, some languages do have some form of time independence in them. For example, the Chinese language. In that language it's possible to say an action without a sense of time. Unfortunately, that isn't possible for me and most of my viewers, but it's possible for some languages and for the Argonians. Maybe if there's some Chinese viewer here, maybe he can explain it better in the comments. If you're there, explain it, please. However, learning the concept of time dependence in other languages and the time independence of Gel is by far the biggest struggle for anyone trying to learn Gel or trying to learn another language if their native language is Gel. As far as we know, there's no fluent Gel speaker among non-Argonians. A lot of other races can learn it, they can speak it, and they can understand it, for example as diplomats or whatever function they may have in Blackmarsh. We know of some humans that have learned it to a good extent, but they will never truly be fluent. They will never learn the subtleties in pronunciation that can change up everything, or the body language aspect of it in such a perfect way that they can convey their feelings in a right way. In terms of Argonians, well, as we've seen in the games, Argonians can pretty much learn our language. It's very hard for them to learn it at first, but due to the language being more simple, in the sense that it doesn't require any body languages or requires very precise pronunciation. For example, if you have an accent like an Argonian accent, that's fine, people will still understand you. There are many Argonians that are fluid in other languages, of course. That said, the language itself can sound very weird to outsiders. It's said that it can sound like grunts and squeaks to most non-speakers when Argonians speak it very fast. For example, presumably after hearing some Argonians speak their language very quickly, the Mad Emperor Pelagius Septim III waned himself in the illusion that he could actually speak with them in that language. And when an Argonian ambassador came to the palace, he just made random squeaks and noises to an Argonian ambassador. I found that pretty funny. Now, in terms of pronunciation, I'm not even really gonna try to pronounce it correctly, as I have trouble with English as it is, as most of you know. But a lot of the letters and combinations are pronounced very differently in the Gel language. For example, the H is almost always silent. Think about the word An-Xileel, which is usually pronounced as Sez-leel. So the H is completely silent, and the X's get pronounced as Z's. As a final note, Argonian names are often a word or multiple words in Gel, and are sometimes directly translated when an Argonian lives in a different society. Think for example about names like Stands in Shadows, which are the kind of names that you usually hear associated with Argonians. These are names that are translated from their Gel names, and they get these names apparently at birth, when they get in contact with history. It's not known if the parents or the elders give the names to the little Argonians, or if the Hist directly sort of conveys the name upon the little Argonian, but we know it happens at birth. And these names usually describe the Argonian as a person, and can of course be translated to other languages, like I've mentioned before. In all respects, Gel is a very different and difficult language to learn, but it's also very interesting and surprisingly fleshed out in the lore.
And it's even so fleshed out that we even know some swear words in the Argonian language. And well, if we know them, you know that I'm going to tell them to you.
Most of these words we know from the Elder Scrolls novels, the Infernal City and Lord of Souls, but also some from the recent Elder Scrolls Online expansions in Blackmarsh. Argonian swear words are hard to pronounce, but here we go. There's Xuth, which basically means shit or fuck, Kauk, which basically means ignorant, Waxathil, which basically means stupid, and Lukriel, which basically means assimilated. And that's specifically that last one is a slur specifically used against Argonians that have grown up or live in other cultures outside of Blackmarsh and are thus seen as inferior to those grown up in Blackmarsh and living in Blackmarsh within traditional Argonian culture.
And that's about all I can say about Argonians for today. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this big lore collection. Truly, when mashing lore from all these years together, you can really hear how my content has changed over the years. I hope it wasn't too bad and that you were able to listen to it. If not, I am sincerely sorry, but I also suppose that you wouldn't be here anyway. Now, if you made it all the way to the end, why not tell me something about yourself? Specifically, tell me about what your favorite metal is. Is it gold, platinum, silver perhaps? Or perhaps copper? I don't know, tell me. It will really confuse other people in the comments if you're just randomly starting to talk about copper or some other metal. Now, that being said, I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today, and if I did, why not give the video a like, as that's how the mighty YouTube algorithm decides what content to push and what content not to push, so what's worthy and what is not. Alright, this was a long watch for you, so I'll sign off for now. I'll see you back in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, probably this weekend, on another singular topic. Bye bye.